Hey, don't eat that. The voice cut through the chatter of the cafe, loud and clear like an alarm. All eyes turned to the boy standing at the door, his thin, dirty face marked with determination. Malik didn't seem to notice the weight of all those stares. He was locked on the man sitting near the counter, who held a spoonful of soup just inches from his mouth. The scene was surreal. In the corner, a well-dressed woman, Marissa, known to everyone as the man's wife, rose quickly to her feet. "Who is this boy?" she asked, her voice carrying a nervousness thinly veiled by feigned indignation. But Malik didn't take his eyes off the man. "I saw what she did. She put something in your soup, don't eat it." The tension in the air was palpable. The waiter, holding a tray, froze mid-step, unsure of what to do. A couple at a nearby table whispered to each other, while Bernard, the man who had almost tasted the soup, frowned, shifting his gaze between the boy and his wife. Malik looked out of place amidst the luxury. His torn jacket and short pants betrayed a harsh life on the streets. He hadn't known why he'd stopped in front of that cafe that day, but something about the bustle inside had drawn him in. Watching. Through the large windows, he'd seen Marissa open a small bottle and pour its contents into the soup, glancing around as if guarding a secret. He couldn't just ignore it. Malik knew what it was like to live without anyone caring. And now, here he was, staring down a woman who seemed ready to devour him with her eyes. "This is ridiculous," Marissa said, letting out a short laugh, but her hand trembled as she pointed at the boy. "Are you really going to believe a street kid?" Bernard hesitated, lowering his spoon back into the bowl. "What are you saying, boy? Are you sure about what you saw?" "I saw it," Malik replied without wavering. His voice was steady, but his hands shook slightly. He knew he was stepping into something big, but he also knew there was no turning back. The silence that followed Malik's declaration was broken by Marissa's forced laughter. "This is absurd," she said, smoothing her dress with trembling hands. "Bernard, he's lying. He's just trying to cause trouble." Bernard's frown deepened. He glanced at the soup, then back at his wife. "Why would he lie about something like this?" he asked, his voice low but sharp. The murmur of the cafe's patrons grew louder as more people leaned in to watch the unfolding drama. Marissa opened her mouth to respond but hesitated, her eyes darting to the bowl in front of Bernard. That split second of doubt was all Malik needed to press on. "I saw her," he said, his voice growing steadier with every word. "She poured something into your soup when you weren't looking. I'm telling the truth." The waiter, still frozen in place, finally moved forward hesitantly. "Sir, perhaps we should take the soup to the kitchen and have it checked," he suggested, his voice barely above a whisper. Marissa's composure began to crack. "You're going to trust a street kid over your own wife?" she snapped, her tone growing defensive. "This is ridiculous, Bernard. Send him away." But Bernard didn't move. His gaze was fixed on Marissa, his expression a mix of confusion and suspicion. "Marissa," he said slowly, "if there's nothing to hide, then you won't mind if they check the soup, right?" The color drained from her face. For a moment it seemed like she might argue, but then she stepped back, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "Fine," she said, her voice cold. "Do whatever you want, but this is a waste of time." The waiter carefully picked up the bowl and hurried toward the kitchen. The room buzzed with hushed conversations, all eyes shifting between Bernard, Marissa, and the boy who had dared to disrupt the calm of their morning. Malik stood his ground, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what the soup would reveal, but he knew he couldn't let this go. Not now, not after everything he'd seen. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as the patrons of the cafe waited. The hum of whispers filled the room, growing louder with each passing second. Bernard sat stiffly in his chair, his hands clasped tightly on the table. Marissa remained, standing, her arms crossed, her face a mask of cold fury, though her eyes betrayed the storm beneath. The door to the kitchen finally swung open, and the waiter returned, accompanied by a man in a crisp white chef's coat. The chef held the bowl of soup carefully, his face grave. "Sir, we tested the soup," he said, his voice low but firm. "And there is indeed a foreign substance in it, something that doesn't belong." A collective gasp rippled through the cafe. Bernard's eyes widened, his hands loosening as he leaned back in his chair. "What?" he murmured, glancing. "Between the chef and his wife. What kind of substance?" The chef hesitated, then produced a small vial. "We believe this was added to the soup," he said. "It's a chemical compound often used in less than savory purposes. It's tasteless and odorless." Marissa's composure shattered. "This is absurd," she snapped, her voice shrill. "How do you know he didn't put it there?" She pointed a trembling finger at Malik, who stood silently, his expression unreadable. "I didn't," Malik said quietly but firmly. "I saw you. You were the one with the bottle." Bernard stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His face was pale, his jaw tight. "Marissa," he said, his voice heavy with disbelief, "please tell me this isn't true." She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, her shoulders sagged and she sank back into her chair. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I had to." Malik watched as Bernard's face hardened. The boy's heart ached, but he knew he had done the right thing. The truth had to come out, no matter the cost. The cafe was silent, save for the soft rustle of shifting chairs and the faint murmur of voices in the background. Bernard stared at his wife, his face pale and strained. "What do you mean, you had to?" he asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Marissa looked away, her gaze fixed on the floor. "You wouldn't understand," she said quietly, her voice hollow. I didn't know what else to do." Bernard's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Didn't know what else to do?" he repeated, his tone rising. "You tried to poison me, Marissa. How do you expect me to understand that?" The tension in the room was suffocating. Malik, standing near the door, shifted uncomfortably. He felt out of place, like an intruder in a moment that wasn't his. But he couldn't leave. Not yet. One of the cafe patrons, an elderly woman sitting near the window, broke the silence. "If the boy hadn't spoken up," she said softly, "we might have witnessed something terrible today." Her words carried a weight that settled heavily over the room. Marissa's head snapped up. "You don't know anything about my life." She spat, her voice sharp and defensive. "None of you do." Bernard took a step closer to her, his expression softening for just a moment. "Then tell me," he said quietly. "Explain it to me. Because right now I can't understand how the woman I married could do something like this." Marissa hesitated, her lips trembling. Finally, she took a deep breath and began to speak. "You don't see it, Bernard," she said, her voice filled with bitterness. "You have everything, wealth, power, respect, and I'm just a shadow in your life. Invisible, unimportant." Bernard's brows furrowed. "Marissa, you've always been important to me," he said, but his words sounded hollow even to himself. "Important?" she scoffed, shaking her head. "You don't even notice when I'm in the room anymore. I tried to talk to you to make you see how unhappy I was, but you didn't care." Her voice broke and she covered her face with her hands. I thought if you were gone, maybe I'd finally matter." The cafe fell silent once more. Bernard stood frozen, the weight of her words pressing down on him. Malik watched the scene unfold, his young heart heavy with emotions he didn't fully understand. Finally, Bernard spoke. "Marissa," he said, softly, "if what you wanted was my attention, you have it now. But this isn't the way." Marissa looked up at him, her face streaked with tears. For the first time, she seemed small and fragile, like a woman caught in a storm she couldn't control. "I didn't know what else to do," she whispered. Again, Bernard turned to the waiter and the chef. "Call the authorities," he said firmly. "This isn't something I can handle on my own." Malik stepped forward hesitantly. "Mr. Bernard," he said quietly, "I'm sorry this happened, but I'm glad you're okay." Bernard looked at the boy, his expression softening. "You saved my life today," he said. "I won't forget that." As the police arrived and began to question Marissa, Malik slipped out of the cafe and into the streets. The day had started like any other, but it had ended with a truth that changed everything for everyone involved. The cool breeze brushed against Malik's face as he walked away from the cafe. The chaos inside had settled into a strange calm, but the weight of the scene lingered in his chest. He hadn't expected to be the one to uncover the truth, but now it was impossible to forget. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't feel like anything special. The world outside the cafe remained unchanged, just as indifferent to him as it had been before. The people inside had their lives, their wealth, their power, and he was just a boy from the streets trying to survive. Yet something in the pit of his stomach stirred as he walked through the empty streets. The boy who had entered that cafe hadn't known what he was doing, but now he understood. Maybe, just maybe, his voice mattered. Maybe he didn't have to be invisible, just like Marissa had felt. Maybe in some small way he could change the narrative. As he passed a narrow alley, a rusted metal can clattered across the ground, drawing his attention. He paused, eyeing the graffiti-covered walls. The alley, as worn and forgotten as the rest of the city, suddenly felt different. He thought of Marissa and Bernard, how their lives would never be the same again. And he thought of his own life. Could he do better than just surviving? A shadow fell across the alley, and Malik turned to see an older man, someone he recognized. From the market, he was carrying a basket of fruit, a gentle smile on his face. "You did good today, kid," the man said, his voice gruff but kind. "Saw what happened back at the cafe?" Malik nodded, unsure of what to say. His throat felt tight, like the world was still spinning too fast for him to catch up. The man studied him for a moment, then spoke again. "I know things aren't easy for you, but you've got guts. That's something not everyone has." He paused, setting the basket down in front of Malik. "You ever need a job, let me know. I've got a stand at the market." "Could use a hand." Malik blinked, taken aback. "You'd give me a job?" The man chuckled. "Why not? You've got the heart for it. You'll figure out the rest." For the first time that day, Malik felt something close to hope. He hadn't expected anything from the world, but this was something different. It wasn't a miracle, but it was a start. "Thanks," Malik said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll think about it." The man nodded and picked up his basket. "You do that, kid. Take care of yourself." As the man walked away, Malik stood still for a moment, looking up at the sky. The streets around him felt a little less harsh. Maybe, just maybe, there was a place for him here after all. He turned down the street, his pace a little lighter, his thoughts a little clearer. The world wasn't perfect, but it didn't have to be. Sometimes all it took was one small act to remind someone that they mattered, and maybe, just maybe, he could make a difference.